All right, so starting another video, and this one's on government and religion, part two. And so I'll be reading some of this here off of this is from an essay I wrote some time ago, and so I will be reading some and then filling in the rest with just some extra information. So this is on the relationship between government and religion. So I titled "The Problem of the Symbiotic Relationship Between Government and Religion," and the development and sustainment of societies was the actual title. Now, I do use a few references here. I use The Ancient World. It's a book by Nagel and Burstein. Also, the Magna Carta. That's a famous document in history signed by King John. The U.S. Constitution, and even the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy in General by Karl Marx. Not a fan of Marx, but I will use him here. Niccolo Machiavelli, use some of his things here. And then also Potter's information on the social gospel theology. That's in here as well. So again, sorry if my eyes sort of wander down. I am kind of reading certain things and then I'm adding to it and expressing, different aspects of it. So government and religion, they've been historically intertwined in a symbiotic relationship throughout history. Whether we like to think of separation of church and state, that government and politics are separate, they're really not. And I'll try to make that argument here. So, and even though it's necessary for a society to develop, governments and religion both, they help society develop, they help it advance and survive, but they also could prove detrimental to the establishment and exercise of either of those. So if you have too much of one or the other, I guess it can be an issue depending on who has the power. It can also lead to persecution of the lesser power by the greater, whether it's religious or secular. There's sort of a saying that I've used before, that heresy is whatever the inquisitor says it is. So whoever's in charge gets to determine the rules if they have that type of despotic or dictatorship type of authority, if they have that autocratic level of authority. So is it possible to separate the two, government and religion, in a society? According to history, they're not mutually exclusive for the most part. At some point, they appear to need one another to survive. And while in theory it is possible to separate the church and the state, I don't believe such a distinction is. I don't believe it's possible. Theoretically, yes, but I think in all practicality, no, I don't think it is. So from the earliest civilizations, we find that as people congregated and went to a central area, there was a need for a code of laws. This became necessary. An early example of this is Hammurabi, right? He had a collection of laws. And in the epilogue of his collection, Hammurabi wrote, quote, "Let him read my words and pray with a full heart before Marduk, my god, and Zarpanit, my lady, and may the protecting deities, the gods who enter Esagila, the great temple of Marduk at Babylon, daily in the midst of Esagila, look with favor on his wishes." End quote. Now, the earliest collection of laws to govern a society was intertwined with religion. You have Hammurabi's code, but he believed that the gods were involved in that. And so in this case, it was the worship of the god Marduk and the goddess Zarpanit. Probably not pronouncing those right, but I'll work on it. And so these laws were not necessarily written to promote justice, but to provide some sense of structure and order in an emerging empire. It would be difficult to have a united empire wherein every region would have different laws governing it. Now, to the Sumerians, these laws were at once secular and religious, and there was no distinction made between the two. Similarly, in the book of Exodus, right, when God gives Moses the Ten Commandments, you see the law of the land, and the law that was meant to govern society, and that was given by God. So in other words, in the case of the Sumerians, the gods were involved. In case of the Israelites, Yahweh was involved, right? The God of the Israelites. And so, hold on a second. So both of these cases, you have the divine coming down to the human, right? To the mortal. And so government and religion, they're inseparable as long as they're both necessary for the society to develop. Now, if before Hammurabi, the region that later became identified as the Babylonian Empire was made up of city-states, then that made sense that a codified law would be necessary because it would unite them not just under one ruler, but under one framed set of legal structure. Now, in a still developing society, laws become necessary not just for protection, but also for a unified and national identity. And religion operates much in the same way, which is the reason for the dogma, the doctrine, statements or confessions of faith, certain traditions that go along with specific denominations. The Levitical laws of the ancient Hebrews, they functioned in a similar context to this. They were created to enable a coexistence and a measure of justice, again, if not peace, within that framework of that society, a people that were emerging as a nation. Whereas the Sumerians were emerging as an empire, here Israel was emerging as a nation. And these laws were to provide, among other things, protection and a measure of equality, and maybe not necessarily equality, but stability and order. Now, Hammurabi's codified laws, they provided a structure and standard for conduct within that society, which protected what was perceived at that time as order, if not individual rights. Here we have like civil rights, we have individual rights, we have a constitution here in the US that gives us all, or that recognizes, rather, I should say, let me correct that, that doesn't grant us, but rather recognizes that we're all created equal and we've been endowed and empowered with certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, we can be alienated from those by our government, but that's the general idea, is that because we have a divine creator, we have certain rights that are inherent in us. And so the Levitical laws, they were an amalgam. They were kind of a combination of secular and religious practices. The laws that were governing Israel weren't based only on spiritual principles, but also secular ones, which the people living at that point in time in history, they could easily understand, such as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Skin for skin, that type of thing. Now, the Hebrews believed that these laws were given to them through Moses and contained secular and religious laws that pertain to behavior. They pertain to worship, cleanliness, like hygiene, that sort of thing. And regarding the Christian view on the obedience of a secular authority as a spiritual or religious requirement, this is interesting. Christians are instructed to obey and to submit to secular authority as long as those laws are not contrary to the laws of God or the statutes of God. So for the Christian, we're told to follow the law of the land so long as it doesn't contradict or violate the Spirit. So the Apostle Paul, also known as Saul of Tarsus, he wrote about this in his epistle to the Romans. He said, and I quote, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." End quote. For those of you referencing, that was Romans 13, verses 1 through 3 in the New King James. Now, Paul, being a Roman citizen, understood the law quite well, as evidenced by the accounts where he presented himself as a citizen of Rome when it regarded his treatment by Roman authorities. Civil Romanus sum, right? I am a Roman citizen. Paul basically said after they unjustly beat him and imprisoned he and Silas, you're not going to sneak us out the back. You're going to walk us out in the front and acknowledge what you've done, because what you've done is broken that law because I am a Roman citizen. And you did this and you violated the law by doing so. And that was an affront all the way up to Caesar. So now, for all the benefits of the joint government religious society, such as the establishment of moral and ethical principles, problems inevitably arise in the form of consolidation of power among the ruling elite. The abuse of authority by them, and then the subjugation of the people. We see this throughout history. We see an establishment of again, moral and ethical principles, sometimes spiritual principles, where they say this is morally right or ethically right, or it's wrong. Legal doesn't always mean ethical. Legal doesn't always mean right or spiritual. We take serious things like, for instance, slavery. It was once the law of the land, but it was never at one point in history, in my belief, It was never good. It was never ethical. It was never justifiable in any sense of the word. I don't think that you could apply moral relativity to things like slavery. I consider it an evil no matter what culture, no matter what era in history, no matter where what the geography is, where it took place at. Evil. It's just wrong. Now, religious rule, if it's left unchecked, can also produce tyranny. We can see this in our own history, in our recent history, in nations where theocracy is the ruling government, from the Crusades to the Inquisition, to the American policy of manifest destiny, right? Where God wants us to spread out from sea to shining sea and create a nation, I won't say under God like the pledge, but essentially manifest destiny was like basically God wants us to have all of this. And it's like we have this idea of exporting democracy to the world, for instance, and we see it as a religious mandate at times. And so if we do, that's not the way that we're to be. So like manifest destiny, we see religion used as a means of waging war on those people with opposing viewpoints. I mean, at its worst, again, the inquisitor defines heresy, and the state enforces the persecution and prosecution of the offenders, so-called. And accordingly, there's a great debate between regarding the separation of church and state. But in establishing a civilized society, a system of belief is, in my opinion, inseparable from the ruling or government system. We often hear of the separation of church and state, but is it possible? Now, the First Amendment of the Constitution, it's often cited as an argument in favor of the separation of church and state. But here's how it reads. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. End quote. That's in the U.S. Constitution. That's the First Amendment. Now, the language in the First Amendment doesn't specifically state that the church and state are separate, but simply that Congress cannot pass laws establishing a state religion that requires people to observe that religion, or to keep the citizens from exercising their religion of choice. In essence, it allows for freedom of religion without state-sanctioned persecution. So I'll read that again. It allows for the freedom of religion, or the freedom not to practice religion, right, without state-sanctioned persecution. And we as private citizens can disagree. We as human beings can disagree. We as people who are loyal to a certain religion or denomination, we can disagree with one another. And oftentimes, unfortunately, we attack one another for that. But what the First Amendment specifically lays out is the fact that the government itself, cannot persecute or prosecute for practicing your belief system, for practicing your faith or worship, as long as it doesn't violate the rights of another person. Now, there are those who would argue that the communist ideal of the separation of church and state is promoted by the First Amendment. But they'd be hard-pressed to find justification for the form of communism that was implemented by the Bolshevik Revolution and that was furthered by Lenin and reached unimagined levels of terror under the regime of Joseph Stalin. Now, other historical documents regarding the expanding liberties of humankind, such as the Magna Carta, have religion and government intertwined also. And they use terminology such as, quote, we have granted all these things for God for the better ordering of our kingdom, end quote. That's in the Magna Carta. Now, Karl Marx argued for the separation and even the extinguishment of religion. There was no place in his ideology or philosophy for religion, much less the free practice and exercise thereof. In his vision, there was absolutely no place for religion. In Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx said, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. It's the heart of a heartless world. I'm sorry, I'm quoting. Just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is required for their real happiness, end quote. So religion for Marx was a product of what he called self-alienation. And for Marx, happiness was elusive so long as religion existed. Now think about that. For Marx, as long as any religion existed, no one could be truly happy. That was one of his foundations and basis for his philosophy. I don't think it's true at all. I think there's a fulfillment in the practice of our faith and a belief system. There's fulfillment in prayer. There's peace in that. And also, happiness is one of those things where it could be considered relative to the person. What makes one happy may not make another happy. So the abolishment of the free exercise of one's worship and faith, to me, I would say that leads to control and persecution, not to happiness. So I'm at odds with Marx against this. Now, I disagree with him, and I feel he would have done better to work on eliminating persecution of all kinds, not just eradicating religion. I think he made a huge mistake in doing that. And I think we're all responsible for the things that we say, the things that we write, the things that we express. And so I hold Marx accountable for that. To replace a religious tyrant for an atheist one does nothing to advance the freedom of humanity. Absolutely nothing. I don't see any rationale in replacing one tyrant for another, one despot for another, regardless of their worldview. Persecution and oppression is persecution and oppression. Now, going on, the First Amendment, it protects rather than abolishes the free exercise of religion. So it's the opposite of Marx's philosophy. And again, people will disagree with me. They'll disagree with me on what Marx said, even though I quoted him directly. And again, that famous religion is the opiate of the masses, that's sort of a paraphrasing of it. But to him, you couldn't be happy. So, but again, rather than abolish the exercise of religion, the First Amendment actually protects it and guarantees it, recognizes it, I guess I would say. Now, Machiavelli, on the other hand, he saw the benefit of religious government, depending on the situation. Of ecclesiastical principles, Machiavelli said, principality. He said, such principalities are won by prowess or by fortune, but are kept without the help of either. So what does this mean? He said they're maintained, in fact, by religious institutions so powerfully mature that no matter how the ruler acts and lives, they safeguard his government. Again, that's something that Machiavelli wrote. Now, I believe the argument can be made that he would have praised a religious government if it were successfully obtained and defended, and he would have reviled it if it had been unsuccessful in that same endeavor. Now, again, because we have Machiavelli known for the philosophy of the ends justifies the means, the outcome would have then been to Machiavelli of the utmost importance. What is it going to produce? For Marx, it produced unhappiness at the very least, in his view. In Machiavelli, what would it produce? It would be whatever it produced would be what justified it in Machiavelli's eyes. Now, Nietzsche found religion to be life-denying, and he wanted the world to know his expression in his writing, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, right? God is dead, was his quote. Now, to Nietzsche, this old system of morality was based on the belief in a deity, and it was outdated to him. Religion, to Nietzsche, denied the value of the present life, and he valued that only the alleged and assumed life was to come is what religion valued. So in other words, there was no happiness in this life. Religion had no value in this life. It would only be valuable theoretically in the life to come. So to him, it didn't have any value because there was no afterlife. Now, on the other hand, where does that leave much of the moral and ethical principles that many societies are built upon? I believe it's attributed to Dostoevsky, but maybe not. But it's basically, if God is dead, then all is permissible. We'll have to look that up. But in other words, if we don't have a supreme deity, or if we don't have the supreme or a spiritual, moral, and ethical something to back it up, then what stops us from really denigrating into a really savage society, right? So if there is no God and there is no higher moral principle, then everything is permissible. Why not do everything? And there are deeper philosophies when it comes to arguing those types of theories. But for me, of all of the possible solutions to the problem of the inseparability of religion and government, because I don't see them as, again, being mutually exclusive throughout history. I don't see it as being able to separate those two. Not truly. So out of all of the solutions to this, and the potential of oppression and the abusive nature that can come with that, I believe the only solution is really to adapt. Now, I'll explain. In the 19th century in America, there was a belief and a movement known as the social gospel. And I don't adhere to this, but I'll explain it. The social gospel said that the second coming of Christ could not occur until mankind solved its own social problems through its own effort with the application of Christian ethics. It's very similar to like the social justice, the idea of social justice, except these were through the applications of Christian ethics. And Christ could not come back. There would be no second coming of Christ until we solved our own problems using Christian principles. That was the social gospel. Now, the theology of the social gospel was one where, and I'll quote this from Potter's book, the church, quote, the church as a transformational institution would stand up for those who had no voice and provide for those who could not do enough to help their own families, end quote. So it's very similar to the modern welfare system, and also what we would call the idea of social justice, where those who did not have a voice, those who were not able or are not able to speak up for themselves, will be provided that voice by the church. Excuse me. Now, here's something interesting. I believe it's in James where he talks about pure religion and undefiled is to help the widow and the orphan, right? We're to help the foreigner in our land and things like that. And now these are things that were later adopted by, like, for instance, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, we need a welfare system that protects people because we're in a Great Depression. I've heard many ministers say, and I sort of lean towards this way too, that had the church as a whole, the body of Christ, been walking in their purpose and their call, there would be no need for a welfare system. Now, that's not to say that they could help every single person out. That's not to say that they could fund every person and make sure everybody has what they need to live and survive. But it would certainly be minimized if the church, and I'll go on record as saying this, and I will also might get bit for it a little bit. But yes, it is our responsibility. Jesus said, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to help the poor. That's what he did. And we can sit there and argue about salaries of clergy. We can argue about whether or not people need a personal jet to fly around to share the gospel in an age where we have internet and live streaming such as this. Now, we could argue all of those things, but the bottom line is this. We've been given a mandate by Christ in the Great Commission, not only to preach the gospel, the good news of Christ, and to baptize others in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but in our fruit. Are we showing the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Are we doing that? Are we helping to clothe those that need it? Are we helping to feed those that need help? And I don't mean out of obligation. I mean out of the heart of God, the very heart of God. So getting back to the social gospel, it says, this wasn't necessarily a solution, that's what I wrote before, to the problem of the symbiosis of religion and government, but it was a way to work within the system using Christian practices and beliefs. So instead of a theocracy, it involved the church speaking for, not ruling over, the people. So I'll say that one again. It wasn't a theocracy. The whole idea behind it, even though I don't agree with it, because I don't agree that Christ is waiting for us to solve our problems to come back. I think we have problems, and that's why he comes back. And I can go more in depth on another message on that. But again, I want to reiterate this: the social gospel, in this way, it was really good. It involved the church speaking for, not ruling over the people, not ruling over the congregation. They could, yes, lead, but they were also there to inspire and to speak up for, to provide that voice, to stand in the gap for those who couldn't stand themselves. That's what it was for. The solution, it's not in eliminating government or religion. I'm not promoting that, but rather understanding how they work together to the potential benefit of society. It is possible. I don't believe in the establishment of a state religion, but I don't believe in prohibiting or persecuting the free actions and practices of our faith either, in any religion. And so I believe the First Amendment, though it's imperfect, it's probably the most effective solution that we've come up with for centuries, because this was something even Constantine, the emperor, he and Licinius, when they issued the Edict of Milan in 314, right? They issued this edict that everybody in the Roman Empire could practice whatever belief system they wished, free from persecution. And that was some 1400 years before the Declaration of Independence, almost 1500 years prior to this. So I think that is as genius of a human idea as we can get when it comes to the idea of government and religion being intertwined, because I don't think that you can separate them completely. I don't think so. So again, the church speaking for, not ruling over the people. Now, again, the First Amendment, it's imperfect, but I still believe right now in our present day, it's the most effective solution in regards to the government and religious societies that it's found in, where no one belief is favored above another. Persecution is diminished, if not outright eliminated. And adaptation through tolerance, combined with the continued growth in communications and relationships between religious adherents, those of the faith, whatever faith that is, not the abolition or abolishment of that religion. And combining that with the government, that's the only plausible solution I can conceive of. And again, this is my own imperfect idea, my own imperfect stance on this, but it involves the church, in my Christian worldview, the church working with the government to help meet those needs and fill the gaps and those cracks where people may fall through. And again, not ruling over. The government isn't supposed to rule over us either. They are our servants. They're public servants, and temporary ones at that. They're not supposed to be in charge for life. Aside from these Supreme Court judges, they have terms. Unfortunately, most of them don't have term limits, which I believe we should do also. Now, that's outside of my spiritual belief. That has to do more with me. I believe that's much more practical, because it really does diminish the idea in my mind of corruption. So it helps prevent that. But again, the First Amendment, I think it's a work of political and spiritual genius kind of mixed together. Maybe I shouldn't use the word spiritual genius. I don't know. Sorry about that. But anyway, that's all I have for right now and for today. Hopefully that made sense to somebody. I know I talk a little fast, but I had a lot to go through, a lot to read and a lot to add. And so God bless you and your families. Happy Veterans Day yesterday to all of those who have served us. We respect you and we admire you, and we thank you for your service. And if there are any questions, please feel free to email me and send me a note. Thanks. God bless you and your family. You take care and be safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.